I remember the first time I saw him. He was just a boy, no older than 14, sitting quietly in the corner of the courtroom waiting area. His hands were clasped together, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't said a single word since he was taken in. Not to the police, not to his lawyer, not even to the social worker assigned to his case. I had been covering court stories for years, but something about this case felt different. There was no clear answer as to why this boy had gone silent. The reports were vague, something about a tragic incident, a family dispute, but nothing concrete. The prosecution wanted answers, but the boy wouldn't give them. His silence became the talk of the courthouse. Some believed he was hiding something. Others thought he was too traumatized to speak. And then there were those who whispered that he was just being defiant, that he knew exactly what he was doing. But as I watched him sitting there, his small frame looking so lost in the oversized chair, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a stubborn act. And then came the hearing, the day everyone had been waiting for. The courtroom was packed, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Lawyers shuffled papers, the judge adjusted her glasses, and the family members sat in heavy silence. And the boy? He sat there, still as a statue. Then, finally, the judge addressed him. "Son, you've remained silent all this time, but now we need to hear from you. Can you tell us what happened that night?" A heavy pause filled the room. Everyone leaned in, waiting, hoping. And then he raised his head. His lips parted, and the words that came out of his mouth stunned the entire courtroom. The courtroom was silent. You could hear the faint hum of the ceiling lights, the distant murmur of voices from the hallway outside. Everyone was frozen, waiting. And then, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, the boy spoke. His voice was quiet at first, so soft that the judge had to lean forward. But his words were clear. "I didn't do it." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. His mother, sitting in the front row, covered her mouth with both hands. The prosecutor stiffened. His defense lawyer sat up straighter, like she had just been thrown a lifeline she wasn't expecting. The judge gave him a long, measured look. "Then tell us, son, what happened that night?" The boy swallowed hard. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the wooden railing in front of him. "I saw everything," he said, his voice stronger now. "But I couldn't say anything until now, because no one would have believed me." The room tensed. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on all of us. The judge nodded. "Go on." The boy took a deep breath, his small chest rising and falling. "It wasn't my father who hurt my mother," he said slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It was him." And then he turned his head, his shaking finger pointing straight at the man sitting behind the prosecution table. A gasp swept through the courtroom. It wasn't his father on trial, it was his uncle. The man's face turned ghostly pale. The prosecutor, who had been building a case against the boy's father for weeks, sat frozen, his pen slipping from his fingers. The defense lawyer's eyes widened in shock. The judge's voice was steady, but firm. "Are you saying your uncle was the one responsible for what happened that night?" The boy nodded, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite describe. Pain, relief, maybe even fear. "Yes," he whispered, "he did it, and I saw everything." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the sound of someone standing up too quickly, but all I could do was stare at the boy, my heart pounding. Because in that moment I realized he hadn't just been silent out of fear. He had been silent because he knew the truth would change everything. For a moment, no one knew what to do. The boy's words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud, threatening to break everything apart. His uncle, the man he had just accused, sat rigid in his seat. His hands, which had been neatly folded on the table, twitched slightly. His face was drained of color, his eyes darting toward the prosecutor as if silently pleading for help. The judge was the first to regain composure. "Young man," she said carefully, "are you saying that your uncle, not your father, was responsible for what happened to your mother?" The boy nodded again, more firmly this time. "Yes." A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney, who had spent weeks trying to prove the father's innocence, looked stunned, like she had suspected something was off but never expected this. The prosecutor stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The boy has refused to speak until now. How do we know he's telling the truth?" The judge held up her hand, silencing the room. Then she turned back to the boy. You understand the seriousness of what you're saying, don't you? The boy swallowed hard but didn't look away. I do. His voice was steady, stronger than before. And then he took a deep breath and said, I can prove it. The courtroom fell so silent, I could hear my own heartbeat. The boy's mother, bruised, fragile, her eyes hollow from weeks of pain, let out a choked sob. She reached for her son, but the bailiff gently held her back. Go on, the judge urged. The boy tightened his fists, his knuckles turning white. There's a video. The room collectively inhaled. I could see the shift happen instantly. The prosecutor stiffened, the uncle's jaw clenched, and the defense lawyer's face lit up with a sudden, desperate hope. What video? The judge asked. The boy licked his dry lips. The security camera outside our house, it recorded everything that night. I swear, I saw the uncle flinch. My dad was inside, the boy continued. He was asleep. He never touched my mom. But my uncle. He hesitated, his voice shaking for the first time. He came to our house, he was angry. He hurt her. And then he told me to stay quiet. He said no one would believe me. That they'd blame my dad no matter what. Tears welled in the boy's eyes, but he didn't break. He had held this truth in for too long. I wanted to speak, he whispered, but I was scared. His mother sobbed into her hands. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Was this footage ever reviewed? The prosecutor looked flustered. The footage was missing when the case was first opened, Your Honor. Missing, or erased. My stomach turned. The judge's voice was sharp now. Bailiff, I want law enforcement to retrieve any remaining copies of the security footage. If this video exists, we need to see it. The bailiff nodded and hurried out of the courtroom. And then, for the first time since the hearing started, the uncle spoke. This is ridiculous, he snapped, standing abruptly. He's lying. But the way his voice wavered, the way sweat gathered at his brow, it told me everything I needed to know. The boy wasn't lying, he had just shattered the truth wide open, and his uncle knew it. The courtroom was a storm waiting to break. The boy's uncle stood stiffly, his hands clenched into fists. His eyes darted from the judge to the prosecutor, to the bailiff who had just left to retrieve the security footage. His face, once composed, was now tense, his jaw tight, his nostrils flaring. I had seen people lie in court before, but this was different. This wasn't just fear. It was the look of a man who knew the walls were closing in. The judge remained calm. Mr. Peterson, she said, his name sharp like a blade. Do you have anything else to say? His mouth opened, then closed. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to find an escape. But there was none. The room was waiting, heavy with anticipation. And then, just when I thought he might deny it again, something unexpected happened. He laughed. A dry, bitter chuckle. The sound sent chills down my spine. You're all really gonna believe him? He scoffed, shaking his head. A scared little kid who's just trying to protect his father? The boy flinched, but he didn't look away. He had already come too far to back down now. The defense attorney stood up. Your Honor, the prosecution built their entire case on circumstantial evidence because the boy refused to speak. But now that he's talking, we have to consider his testimony seriously. If the security footage proves what he's saying, then... Then what? The uncle snapped, his voice rising. You'll just let his father walk free? You think that's justice? The judge banged her gavel. Mr. Peterson, sit down. But he didn't. Instead, he took a step back. A single, trembling step. And that's when I knew he was panicking. Because the truth was finally catching up to him. I glanced at the boy. He was gripping the railing so tightly that his knuckles were white, but his face was steady. He wasn't afraid anymore. The courtroom doors swung open. The bailiff rushed in, holding a USB drive in his gloved hand. His face was unreadable, but I could feel the weight of what he had just found. Your Honor, he said breathlessly, we recovered the footage. A stunned silence. The uncle's face went deathly pale. The judge turned to the courtroom clerk. Play it. And just like that, the entire case, the entire fate of this boy's family, came down to the few minutes of video on that drive. The screen flickered to life, and then we all saw the truth for ourselves. The courtroom held its breath as the screen flickered to life, casting a dim glow across the tense faces in the room. The footage was grainy, its colors slightly washed out, but the scene it captured was clear enough. The timestamp in the corner showed the exact night of the incident, the night everything changed. At first, the screen showed only stillness, the quiet front yard, the faint hum of the porch light flickering slightly, the gentle sway of tree branches in the breeze. Nothing seemed out of place. And then, a shadow moved. A figure emerged from the darkness, striding toward the house with purpose. His steps were fast, his posture rigid. There was something unsettling about the way he carried himself, like a storm rolling in, ready to destroy everything in its path. The boy's father? No. It was the uncle. He reached the front door and without hesitation raised his fist and pounded on it, once, twice, 3 times. Even without sound, the force behind his knocks was clear. The entire courtroom could see it, his aggression, his impatience. Seconds stretched painfully. Then the door creaked open. The boy's mother appeared, hesitating in the doorway. Her face was tense, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't expecting him. And she was afraid. Her arms crossed over her chest, as if trying to shield herself from something unseen. Her shoulders were drawn in tight, her fingers clutching the fabric of her sleeves. It was clear, she was bracing herself. The uncle stepped forward. She instinctively moved back, her body language screaming discomfort. But he didn't care. He followed her movement, closing the distance between them. And then, it happened. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm. She flinched, tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. The struggle was evident. She twisted, attempting to free herself, but he yanked her closer, his fingers digging into her skin. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The mother on the screen tried again, her free hand pressing against his chest in desperation. She was pleading, maybe for him to stop, maybe for him to leave, but he wasn't listening. His body language was sharp, his movements erratic. Then, in an instant, he struck her, hard. Her body jerked back, her head snapping to the side as she stumbled, hitting the porch railing. She barely managed to grab hold of it before collapsing completely. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Even without sound, everyone in that courtroom could feel her pain, her fear. Seconds passed, thick with tension. And then, another figure appeared. Small, hesitant. The boy. He had been there. He had seen everything. A chill settled over the courtroom. The air felt heavy, suffocating. The judge leaned forward, her hands clasped together. Her expression remained unreadable, but the weight of the moment was reflected in her eyes. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The prosecutor tightened her grip on the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. The boy's mother, sitting just a few feet away, had buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders trembled, whether from relief, pain, or both, no one could tell. And the uncle, he didn't move, he didn't speak, because he knew. There was no escaping it now. The footage ended, the screen fading to black. For a moment, the entire courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. It was as if time itself had stopped, trapping everyone in the weight of what they had just witnessed. The truth, raw and undeniable, hung in the air like a heavy fog. The mother sat motionless, her hands pressed tightly over her mouth as if she were holding back sobs. The defense attorney lowered his gaze, letting out a slow, measured breath. The prosecutor straightened, her face unreadable, but her eyes burning with quiet triumph. And then, the judge's voice shattered the silence like a hammer breaking glass. This court will be taking immediate action, in light of this evidence. Her tone was steady, unwavering. She turned to the bailiff, her expression firm. Mr. Peterson is to be taken into custody immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The uncle's head snapped up, his body stiffening, as if he'd just been doused in ice water. Before he could fully process what was happening, 2 uniformed officers stepped forward, their boots echoing against the polished floor. "No, wait," he stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure. His hands twitched at his sides, his breathing quick and shallow. He looked around, desperate, as if expecting someone, anyone, to come to his defense. But there was no one left to save him. The officers seized his arms. He flinched, jerking slightly, but he knew there was no use fighting back. His shoulders slumped, the last traces of his arrogance draining away. For weeks he had held his head high, deceiving everyone with his lies. He had walked freely, unbothered, convinced that no one could touch him. But now, he was just another criminal in handcuffs. As they turned him toward the exit, his gaze landed on the boy, his lips parted slightly, his face unreadable. Was it regret? Anger? Fear? But for the first time, the boy didn't look away. he met his uncle's eyes, his own filled with quiet strength, unafraid, unshaken, because the truth had finally come out, and he was free. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you enjoy emotional, thought-provoking stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Also, share this video with your friends and family, because sometimes a powerful story is all it takes to make a difference. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.